Okay, let's jump right in. Think about Harry Kane stepping up for a penalty kick.
Yeah.
Seems pretty simple, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Just kick the ball, goal, hopefully.
Right. But it's actually incredibly complex when you break it down.
Exactly. All that mental stuff happening beneath the surface. Years of practice, knowing patterns, reading the goalie.
It's all based on these mental blueprints he's built up, which really leads us straight into our topic today, schema theory.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How our minds create these frameworks to just make sense of everything.
Totally. And we're going to dig into schema theory today using the research you sent over. We want to get a clearer picture of how these structures affect how we see things, what we remember.
And maybe where our memory kind of leads us astray sometimes.
Uh-huh.
And it's not just, high pressure sports moments, it's everyday stuff too.
Like what?
Like walking into a restaurant or how you make coffee in the morning. These routines often follow what cognitive psychologists call scripts.
Learn sequences of behavior, basically.
Yeah, shaped by just interacting with the world. Even Kane's penalty kick, that follows a script too, a very refined one.
True.
But today, we're zooming out to the bigger picture, schemas. So maybe let's start there. What exactly is a schema?
Okay. So fundamentally, schemas are mental representations. They come from our past experiences, our knowledge.
Right.
Think of them like mental shortcuts or frameworks. They have a top-down influence, meaning they actively shape how we interpret incoming information from our senses.
So it's not just passive reception.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
They guide how we understand things and then how we behave based on that understanding.
So they're kind of like mental organizers, keeping everything tidy in our heads.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. They have a few key jobs. Organizing knowledge is one. Helping us recall information is another.
Guiding behavior, you said?
Yes, guiding behavior. And really importantly, they help simplify what is, let's face it, a massively complex world.
Simplify, like the telephone example on the sources. That clicked for me.
Yeah.
I can see a totally new phone model, never used it before, but I'm not lost. I have this general phone schema, so I can usually figure out the basics, make a call. Even if it has new features, I kind of slot them into my existing schema, assimilate them.
That's perfect example. Our existing knowledge helps us handle new but related things. And bringing it back to Kane for a sec,
Okay.
think about all the schemas firing off in that moment. He's got one for the pitch itself, the dimensions where players usually are.
One for the goalie, maybe even the specific goalie if he's faced him before.
Absolutely. Based on past games, tendencies, all that feeds into his prediction, where's the goalie likely to go? Where should I put the ball? It's all schema-driven.
Okay, got it. Schemas as knowledge structures.
Yeah.
Helping us understand. Now, how does this link up with memory? How we remember things?
Right, good question. This is where Frederick Bartlett comes in, a real pioneer in cognitive psychology.
Okay.
He was one of the first to really connect schema theory directly to memory. His idea was that schemas aren't just for understanding the present moment. They're also how we organize and store our knowledge and memory. They're the structures that hold our memories.
No, one of the sources brought up something interesting here. This challenge of studying things you can't actually see, like schemas.
Yeah, the philosophical bit. The shift from, say, Freud to behaviorism, which only wanted observable stuff.
Right, and cognitive psychology trying to find a middle ground to study these internal mental processes. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What else do we believe in that we can't directly observe?
Gravity, emotions, consciousness itself.
Yeah. And how important is seeing something to explain it? What kind of evidence convinces you for something invisible?
Those are huge questions in science, especially psychology. And Bartlett, well, he tackled it cleverly. He designed experiments to infer the existence and the impact of these unseen schemas.
How did he do that?
He was really interested in cultural schemas, how our cultural background shapes our mental frameworks, and then how those frameworks affect memory. His famous War of the Ghosts study is the classic example.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. The Native American folktale, right?
That's the one. He gave this story, full of concepts and structures unfamiliar to his British participants, and then simply asked them to recall it later.
And what happened? Did they just forget bits?
It was more than just forgetting. He found people were actively reconstructing the story, often without even realizing it. They were twisting it to make it fit their own cultural norms, their own schemas.
So their British way of seeing the world was kind of overwriting the original story details.
Pretty much. To study this, he used a couple of techniques. One was serial reproduction.
Like the game telephone.
Exactly like telephone. One person reads it, tells it to the next, who tells it to the next, and so on.
Okay.
The other was repeated reproduction. The same person recalls the story multiple times over days, weeks, months.
Ah, so you can see how one person's memory changes over time.
Precisely. Both methods let him track how the story changed.
And what were the main changes he noticed? What kind of patterns emerged?
Several consistent things. First, the stories got shorter. People left out bits they didn't get or thought were unimportant.
Makes sense.
More interestingly, the stories became more conventional. They shifted to fit British cultural expectations. Unfamiliar things got swapped out.
Like what? Can you give an example?
Sure. The story mentions hunting seals. That often became fishing.
Ah, more familiar.
Right. Or a canoe might be remembered as a boat. The order of events sometimes changed too, to make a more logical sequence from their perspective.
Did they add things too?
Sometimes, yes. Adding details or emotions that weren't originally there, likely to make the story resonate more with their own schemas.
So wow, memory really isn't like a video recording, is it?
Not at all. It's much more like putting pieces back together. And our schemas heavily influence which pieces we use and how we arrange them. It's fundamentally reconstructive.
Okay, so memory is reconstructive. Let's talk about the stages of memory then. Encoding, storage, retrieval. How do schemas fit in there?
Right, those three key stages. Encoding is getting the information in. Storage is holding on to it. Retrieval is getting it back out.
And schemas mess with all of them, or just some.
Well, research suggests schema processing can influence all three stages. But a really famous study by Brewer and Treyens in 1981 gives a great example of schemas affecting encoding and retrieval.
Brewer and Treyens, that's the office study.
That's the one, yeah, the office experiment.
Sounds cool. What did they actually do?
Okay, so they wanted to see how our general office schema, our idea of what's typically in an office, would affect memory for an actual office. They had psychology students wait individually in a room designed to look like an academic's office for just about 35 seconds.
Okay, pretty short time.
Yeah. The office had some very typical things, a typewriter, coffee pot, desk, but also some atypical things that don't really fit an office schema.
Like Lee.
Like a skull.
Right.
Or a pair of pliers just lying there. And crucially, some expected things were missing, like there were no books on the shelves.
Oh, clever. And the students didn't know their memory would be tested.
Nope.
Yeah.
That was key. Over 90%, 93% actually said later they had no idea it was a memory experiment. They thought they were just waiting.
Sneaky. So after 35 seconds, they're taken out.
Move to another room, and bam, surprise memory test. Tell us what was in the office.
How did they test them? Just asking them to list things?
They used 3 different ways. Some participants just had to write down everything they could remember. That's free recall.
Okay.
Others were asked to draw the objects in the room and where they were.
Oh, interesting. Visual recall.
Exactly. And a third group got a list of objects and had to say yes or no, was this item in the room?
Yeah.
That's a recognition task.
Right. So different ways of probing memory. What did they find? Did the schema make a difference?
It definitely did.
Yeah.
In the conditions where people had to actively recall the writing and the drawing, they were much better at remembering the schema-consistent items.
The typical office stuff. Desk, chair.
Yep. And they were much worse at remembering the schema-inconsistent items.
The skull, the pliers.
Right. Those things didn't fit the office expectation, so they were less likely to be encoded strongly or retrieved easily.
But what about the recognition test? The list.
Ah, that's where it gets interesting. In that condition, people were actually more likely to correctly identify the weird schema-incongruent items.
Really? Why?
Possibly because those items stood out as unusual. When presented with a name, it triggered the memory. They were also pretty confident about recognizing them.
Okay, but what about the stuff that wasn't there? The missing books?
That's another key finding. People often falsely remembered seeing items that fit the office schema but weren't actually present. Books were the classic example. Lots of people put books in their recall lists or drawings.
Because an office should have books, according to their schema.
Exactly. The schema filled in the gap.
How?
And sometimes they even changed objects they did see to make them fit better.
How so?
Like maybe there was a pad of paper on a chair. They might remember it or draw it as being on the desk. Or a table that was an unusual shape might be recalled as just a standard square table.
Wow. So the schema isn't just about forgetting things that don't fit or adding things that should be there. It can actually distort the memory of things that were there.
Precisely. It really shows how active an interpretive memory is.
Yeah.
Heavily guided by our expectations.
Did they give any numbers on that? Like how many things people got right versus wrong?
They did. In the written recall, for example, people got about 13 and a half objects correct on average.
Okay.
But they also incorrectly recalled, on average, just over 1.13 objects that wasn't there. And as we said, those tended to be very schema-consistent things like books, pens, filing cabinets.
Things you'd strongly expect. That data really seems to support the idea, doesn't it?
It does. It provides quantitative evidence for that schema-driven recall and those intrusions, those false memories.
Right. So we've seen Bartlett, Brewer, and Treyens. Strong evidence for schemas influencing memory. Let's pull back a bit. How do we evaluate schema theory overall? What are its big strengths? Maybe its weaknesses?
Well, on the whole, the evidence is pretty strong that schemas do influence our thinking, our memory. The theory is really useful, I think.
Useful how?
For understanding how we categorize things so quickly, how we interpret ambiguous situations, how we make inferences, going beyond the information given.
And obviously for understanding memory mistakes, distortions, false memories.
Definitely. That's a major application.
But it can't be perfect, right? Are there limitations or criticisms?
Oh, absolutely. One big one is, well, where do schemas actually come from? The theory describes them, but it's a bit vague on how they're formed initially.
Okay, their origin story is a bit fuzzy.
Kind of. And also, the precise mechanisms by which they influence cognition aren't always spelled out in detail. It can feel a bit like a description rather than a full explanation sometimes. And it also struggles a bit to explain why we sometimes actually remember schema-inconsistent information really well, like the skull and the recognition task.
So it doesn't predict everything perfectly?
No theory does, really. But despite these points, it's still considered a really robust and influential theory in cognitive psychology. Research is ongoing.
Okay. Now, the sources mentioned a framework for evaluating theories like this. TEACUP.
Yes, TACUP. It's a handy acronym to check different aspects of a theory's strength.
So let's run schema theory through it. T is for.
Testable. And we've seen it as, right? Bartlett, Brewer, and Treyens, they designed experiments to test hypotheses derived from the theory. So check.
E.
Empirical evidence. And again, there's a lot of research, including those studies, and even some biological work suggesting our brains automatically categorize things, supporting the idea of schema-like processing.
Got it.
Applications. We touched on this. Memory distortion. Therapy for things like anxiety or depression, where schemas might be maladaptive. Understanding relationships, even health campaigns. It has broad applications.
Construct validity. This is about how well-defined the main concepts are. And this is where some criticism comes in. Is schema too vague? Is it really measurable? Some argue it lacks precision.
Okay, a potential weakness there.
Unbiased. Is the theory applicable across cultures? Generally, yes. While early research was Western-focused, the basic idea of using prior knowledge seems universal, even if the content of schemas varies culturally.
Right. And finally, P.
Predictive validity. How well does it predict behavior? It's pretty good at predicting general trends, like we'll probably forget irrelevant details from a news story, but predicting exactly what one specific person will remember, not so much. It predicts patterns more than specifics.
So overall, using TCUP.
It scores pretty well. It's testable, has evidence, lots of applications, reasonably unbiased, but maybe a bit fuzzy on construct definition, and its predictive power is more general than specific. A solid, useful theory, but not without questions.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, a real deep dive into how these mental frameworks operate.
Yeah, it's fundamental stuff. So, to kind of wrap up the core idea, our existing knowledge, our schemas, fundamentally shape how we take in new information and what we remember about it later. We saw Bartlett showing memory isn't playback, it's reconstruction, shaped by our culture.
Yeah, the War of the Ghosts really hammered that home.
And Brewers and Treyens showing how our expectations about, say, an office influence what we notice, what we miss, and even what we falsely remember.
Right. It underlines that we're not passive observers. Our minds are constantly actively interpreting based on what we already know or think we know.
Which leads to a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. Think about the schemas you hold, about your job maybe, your friendships, even how you understand the news.
Good question.
How might those ingrained expectations, those mental shortcuts, be quietly filtering what you notice, what sticks in your memory, and ultimately how you perceive reality itself? It's definitely something worth reflecting on, how our own internal frameworks are shaping our world.